You're not a typical college audience. I am deeply grateful to ACTA. This award privileges me by placing me in the company of so many heroes of liberty, of decency, and I see in this room as well so many heroes of liberty. It's an extraordinary event for me. In particular, I thank Michael Polyakov for his extraordinary kindness to me and his ongoing contributions to the good cause. And I am overwhelmed and would never know how adequately to respond to those of you who introduced me. But Ravi and Brad and Alan, thank you from the bottom, from the marrow. So let me talk about the last 35 years. Starting in the mid-'80s, I truly thought that I could win. I thought that I would win, that public exposure of the betrayal of liberty and legal equality and privacy on America's campuses would undo the politicized structure of higher education. I just had to make people know what was occurring. I was sure I would win. And with the water buffalo case in 1993, if you don't do it, I've never gotten a royalty, the Shadow University, Chapter 1. With the water buffalo case in 1993, 30 years ago this past spring, I thought I had simply won. The media, down to Gary Trudeau and Doonesbury. Trudeau sent me a full-color original of his excoriation of Sheldon Hackney, president of Penn, of the insanity of speech codes. I thought, I've got Sunday Doonesbury. I've won. The Washington Post editorialized in my favor in the same language as the Wall Street Journal. NBC News gave 10 minutes to the water buffalo case, John Chancellor presenting it as the madness of academics who wanted to police language and deprive us of the most ordinary benefits of plain speaking. On Crossfire, for those of you who might remember, it was the one and only time, the water buffalo case, when Kinsley and Buchanan agreed entirely. And every liberal newspaper in Philadelphia was on my side. The Philadelphia Daily News called the administration at Penn a herd of dick-dicks, violating both the racial and the sexual harassment code. Universities were exposed. Penn was a laughingstock. Trustees met in September and repealed the speech code. Wouldn't the next decades be absolutely grand? Alas, no. I began fighting speech codes, intrusive political training, invasions of conscience, double standards, and kangaroo courts in the mid-1980s, fighting these things at Penn, but talking at colleges and before groups interested in what was happening. I was stunned by the lack of understanding on our campuses among the very people who were living through new forms of authoritarian and abusive control over the life of the mind. In 1980, deciding I had to reach a larger and different audience, I wrote an op-ed in 1989 for the Wall Street Journal. My editorial was about speech codes at Penn and the introduction of racial sensitivity training for student life staff and for defendants in the campus judicial system. In October 1989, about 34 years ago from today, I wrote the following, quote, I now become my co-author of this. The subsidized activists, I wrote, facilitators and social engineers who work in student life and support services are a powerful force in the academic world. They attend conferences together and they testify to each other's successes. They are the expertise that other activist officials call upon to justify with expert testimony their own programs. They share language and conceptual schemes. Culture is not an evolved system that confers survival and life-enhancing benefits upon its inheritors, adapting as material conditions and ways of thinking change, but a system of creating and preserving, quote, hegemonic dominance for white males, end quote. Diversity, and their quote, still my quote, diversity does not mean diverse individuals for them. It is the recognition for them of the primacy of group identity, close quote. I wrote about a brave undergraduate on the planning committee for diversity education who wrote to her colleagues about, quote, my deep regard for the individual and my desire to protect the freedom of all members of society, and still quoting from my 1989 editorial, which led an administrator on the committee to reply to her, the word individual is a red flag phrase today, which is considered by many to be racist. Arguments that champion the individual over the group ultimately privilege the individuals belonging to the largest or dominant group, close quote. I concluded, quote, the practical strengths of such a movement are obvious. The legitimate complaints of truly harassed individuals, the intellectual support for such notions of culture in America within the professoriate, the ability of New Age ideologues to threaten negative publicity and disruption, the radicals' almost uncontested control of moral symbolism. Its moral vulnerabilities, however, are also legion. The Orwellian substitution of thought reform for behavioral sanctions, the desire for essential freedom of speech and expression by professors and undergraduates, if only. The ability of its potential intellectual allies to distinguish between authentic education and tendentious indoctrination. Wrong again. The unwillingness of administrators to defend intellectual repression under public scrutiny, and the manifest wickedness of imposing group identities upon the universities of a nation with a right to individuate according to private conscience remains the authentic criterion of liberation. We shall see, close quote. 1989, still waiting. From the 1980s until my last day of teaching at Penn, less than 10 years ago, I framed the issue as a generational swindle. Quote, the heirs of the 60s who run universities today, my talks from the late 90s all through the late 80s, all through the 90s, have moved at more and more campuses from their free speech movement to their speech codes, from their struggle against mandatory chapel to their own struggle for mandatory diversity education and sensitivity seminars, from their struggle for racial integration to their efforts for newer forms of separate racial programs. American students are victims of a generational swindle of truly epic proportions. Close quote. I believed that the campus zealots had succeeded in institutionalizing their agenda and their programs, but they had failed to win the students. Too many students remained independent and critical in their thought and values. Most so-called minorities deeply rejected any truly radical politics. Most whites just did not feel guilty about their birth. Women and men, far from perceiving each other as class enemies, continued to fall in love and even write each other poetry, if not collaborations far, far worse. In 1984, there occurred a shift of extraordinary importance in American academic life. Up until 1984, faculty held on to the belief inherent in the culture of the 60s that they were the voice of students, that students were theirs. In 1984, a significant majority of American college students voted for Ronald Reagan. The professoriate looked up with an, "Oh my God, we have to save them from themselves. We have to save them from American society. And we have to save American society from a generation of our brightest and best that voted for Ronald Reagan." You may date, not political correctness, you may date coercive political correctness, abusive, arbitrary, tyrannical political correctness from that sense of, oh my God, they did what? The 60s were over. Faced with that reality, campus ideologues imposed whole new regimes of intrusive political and cultural inquisition and catechism, which reinforced the agitprop that many students already had been getting from grade school through high school graduation. But think on this. For college students, this was the pinnacle of the educational pyramid, and they assumed that it had all been vetted by the best minds in the country. It all must have been vetted by the best minds at a university. Before you blame students, remember, when they arrive after high school, they're introduced to universities, the lives of the mind, in an orientation that is a political boot camp. But what they hear, they all assume has been vetted by the finest minds in the country. Don't blame students. We have allowed them to be miseducated from kindergarten through PhD by people who loathe this country and its deepest values. In high school, they can be skeptical, right? Mr. X, Miss Y could be wrong. But the faculty of Harvard, the faculty of Penn, the faculty of a place astute enough to admit me, they believe they are being introduced to the acquired knowledge of our society. I was hoping that the split between faculty and students would last until students and their allies demanded an end to the PC tyranny. There was a window from the mid-1980s to maybe 2015 when students, despite a full generation of indoctrination and agitprop in K through undergraduate, were the hope of individualism and liberty in higher education. Those of us who engaged, as did many of you here, had so much success with students, but now the zealots and partisans reap the benefit of what they sowed as lords of the university. Those undergraduates who agree with them reign on our campuses. The independents hear no other voices. The dissidents are terrified or silenced. The despisers have won undergraduate culture, even if they have not won all undergraduates. The worst scenario actually occurred. Indoctrination, political catechism, guerrilla theater agitprop, and incentives to join the woke mob changed their recipients. Think about incentives in a college campus. How much easier to come out on campus sexually than to come out as a classical liberal or conservative, or God forbid, a Republican. I was wrong also, alas, about a deep backlash that I expected long ago, decades ago, warning in 1989, quote, "It will not last. America patiently has subsidized critics who have the utmost contempt for its values of individual identity and individual rights, but it is an utterly absurd supposition that the victims of partisan codes, intrusions of conscience, lack of due process, and selective biased enforcement of campus regulations will acquiesce indefinitely in the double standards upon which their campus legal inequality depends. There will be a day of reckoning, but when it comes, God help us, because where will one then find a broad coalition already formed around the love of liberty, due process, free speech, and legal equality? Where will all our self-proclaimed progressive academics find shelter when those winds blow, after they themselves have attempted to convince everyone who passes through their portals that liberty and legal equality are wholly tactical and dispensable?" End quote. That was in a different piece in 1989. The patience of such long acquiescence in being the victims of double standards is beyond anything I could have imagined, even now, even today, even with the news of the last week. Let me conclude. Our schools have become the enemies of a free society. Stop the subsidies. One may not give in. One may not give up. There always will be alternatives for the kids of parents who know and understand the great moral, political need and task, and the great intellectual need and task is also to create alternatives, school choice writ large, for all the other kids. It is, above all else, our liberty and legal equality that define us as human beings with dignity, capable of morals. The struggle for that freedom in higher education has been one of the defining struggles of the age in which we find ourselves. Whether you would locate a true higher education in the reform of current universities or in new models and venues, do not let that struggle end, and join it with rigor, vigilance, will, and courage. The recovery of liberty and dignity begins with and depends upon the education of the minds and souls of our children. There are no sidelines. And thank you all for being here.